In the hallowed halls of justice, where the scales are meant to balance and due process reigns supreme, there are moments when the very foundations of fairness seem to tremble. This is one such story, a tale of an attorney who refused to be silenced, a judge who wielded power like a weapon, and a courtroom battle that would redefine what it means to stand for what is right. Prepare to witness a masterclass in legal strategy, a testament to unwavering courage, and a reminder that true power lies not in the gavel, but in the truth. Before we delve into this gripping narrative, if you're captivated by stories of resilience, intellect, and the triumph of justice, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and comment below with your thoughts as the drama unfolds. Your engagement fuels our mission to bring these powerful stories to light. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday for Caroline Levit, a day like countless others spent navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the legal system. Courtroom 3B, nestled in the bustling heart of Tampa, was as familiar to her as her own reflection. Its polished oak benches, the hushed murmur of anticipation, the scent of old paper and stale coffee, all were part of a routine that had long since lost its novelty. Today's docket promised nothing more than a procedural matter, a minor dispute that by all accounts would barely register a blip on her morning schedule. Having faced countless judges within these very walls, Caroline carried herself with the composed confidence of a seasoned professional, her presence a quiet testament to years of meticulous preparation and strategic execution. Or so she thought. Seated at the defendant's table, her posture was effortlessly poised, her face an unreadable mask as she calmly skimmed through her notes. Across the room, the city attorney, a nervous twitch in his tie, shifted restlessly in his chair, a silent drumbeat of anxiety accompanying his wait for the judge's arrival. Little did he, or anyone else, know that the calm before the storm was about to shatter with a force that would reverberate far beyond the confines of courtroom 3B. The case, as listed, was indeed a minor dispute, a simple administrative matter slated for no more than 10 minutes. But the moment Judge Raymond Dalton strode into the room, a chill snaked down Caroline's spine. Something was undeniably off. Dalton was a man who commanded a room without uttering a single word. Tall, with a distinguished graying beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through pretense, he exuded an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Normally, judges took a moment, a customary pause to review files, offer a nod to the attorneys, and settle into their imposing chairs before making any remarks. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection, his expression utterly unreadable. Caroline straightened almost imperceptibly, sensing the abrupt shift in tone, the sudden acceleration of a process usually steeped in measured deliberation. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Dalton continued, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, "and after considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $10,000, payable immediately." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the courtroom. Caroline's brow lifted just the slightest fraction, a flicker of surprise that quickly vanished, but inside, her mind was already a whirlwind of furious calculation. She had anticipated an argument, a discussion, perhaps even a warning, but this, a summary judgment, delivered with the finality of a guillotine, without a single word of discussion, without the opportunity to present her side, it was unprecedented. The city attorney, pale and visibly uncomfortable, glanced at her, almost apologetic. Even he hadn't expected the case to move with such ruthless speed. Caroline calmly folded her hands on the table, her voice emerging even and steady, betraying none of the shock that had momentarily seized her. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my argument." Dalton barely blinked. His eyes, cold and unwavering, met hers. The room was still, too still, the air thick with unspoken tension. She wasn't the kind of attorney to lose her composure, but something about this felt deeply deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling, this was a statement. She glanced at Dalton, studying him, searching for the tell. There was something behind his eyes, a confidence that went beyond simple judicial authority. He wasn't just ruling on a case, he was putting her in her place. Her voice remained measured, but a new, steely firmness had entered it. If the law were that clear, Your Honor, we wouldn't be here. I request the opportunity to present my defense. Dalton leaned back slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible curl of his lips suggesting he had anticipated her pushback. You're welcome to try, Miss Levitt, but I assure you the outcome will be the same. That was when she knew. This wasn't just about the case, it was about her. Caroline adjusted the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity, her fingers brushing the crisp edges of the legal brief. The fine itself wasn't the issue. She had fought bigger battles, faced down far more daunting sums. But the principle, that was something she couldn't ignore. She met Dalton's gaze directly, her eyes unwavering. Then I suppose we should get started. The tension in the room thickened, palpable, almost suffocating. The city attorney shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. The court stenographer, silent until now, repositioned in her chair, a subtle acknowledgement of the impending drama. Even a few spectators in the back, mostly lawyers and law clerks waiting for their own cases, leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual, something truly significant was about to unfold. Caroline took one last fleeting glance at the legal brief in front of her, though she didn't really need it. She already knew exactly what she was going to do. Dalton thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. But before anyone could speak again, Caroline raised her hand, a signal that she wasn't finished, and what came next would leave the entire courtroom stunned.
Caroline let the silence linger, stretching it thin, allowing its weight to settle upon every person in the courtroom. She didn't rush, didn't flinch, her composure a stark contrast to the simmering tension that now permeated the air. With deliberate slowness, she turned a single page in her folder, the crisp whisper of paper, a subtle punctuation mark in the stillness, more for theatrical effect than any genuine necessity. Finally, her gaze left it, locking onto Judge Dalton. Her voice, when it came, was steady, unwavering, cutting through the silence like a finely honed blade. Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something. Her tone was deceptively mild, almost conversational. Are you saying that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding? Dalton's expression remained as unyielding as granite. I'm saying the violation is clear and the fine stands. Caroline tilted her head slightly, as if truly considering his words, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Then she nodded. Interesting. Dalton's eyebrow arched, a flicker of irritation in his deep-set eyes. Excuse me? Caroline leaned back just a fraction, maintaining her casual tone, yet each word was delivered with surgical precision. It's just, I've been practicing law for quite some time, Your Honor, and in all those years, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it. It's, what's the phrase, unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. Caroline knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him yet. She was setting the stage, forcing him to respond, to acknowledge the glaring procedural anomaly he had just created. The spectators in the gallery, mostly fellow lawyers and law clerks waiting for their own cases, were now fully invested, their subtle shifts and exchanged glances indicating their rapt attention. Even the bailiff, a man who probably witnessed 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly in his stance. Dalton let out a slow, controlled breath, his voice laced with thinly veiled exasperation. Miss Levitt, this court does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands and we move on. Caroline gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He'd opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time her eyes didn't drop to the documents. They remained fixed on the judge. Very well. Let's talk about Local Statute 14b, the one you claim I violated. She tapped a manicured finger lightly on the printed document in front of her. You say the law is clear, but that's interesting because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years, with varying interpretations. Dalton's eyes narrowed, a subtle tightening around their corners. The language in subsection C, for example, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year, a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under this statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom was completely silent, the air thick with the weight of her words. Caroline could feel the shift happening, a subtle but undeniable rebalancing of power. The judge knew it too. Dalton straightened in his seat, his tone sharpening, a desperate attempt to regain control. Those cases do not apply here. Caroline didn't miss a beat. Don't they? She turned another page, the soft rustle echoing in the quiet, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language in the ruling in Reynolds v. City of Clearwater was pretty clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words sink in, allowing their full implications to resonate, before adding, "And I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore a precedent." Dalton clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on her, a silent battle raging in his eyes. Caroline let that hang in the air for just a second before delivering the next decisive blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him, his posture mirroring hers. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Miss Levitt? Caroline exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh without amusement. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom, a collective gasp of recognition. Caroline had done something subtle, but profoundly important. She had shifted the power dynamic. She had forced the judge to defend his position, rather than simply issuing rulings without question. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly up until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off, his eyes still locked on Caroline's. There was a long, agonizing pause, punctuated only by the rapid beat of unseen hearts. Then finally, the judge spoke, his voice tight with reluctant concession. Very well, you may present your defense. Caroline smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear he wasn't going to make this easy.
Judge Dalton didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the bench. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Caroline recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about control. He wanted to make sure she understood exactly where she stood in his courtroom. But she wasn't the type to be intimidated. She adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable, her internal resolve hardening. Let's start with the language of the statute itself, she began, tapping her papers. Local Statute 14b claims that any entity failing to comply with the municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough. But the issue arises in how compliance is defined. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, looking unimpressed, a subtle sneer on his lips. And yet, Miss Levitt, this statute has been enforced repeatedly without issue. Caroline tilted her head, a hint of challenge in her eyes. That's interesting, because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She glanced briefly at the city attorney, whose discomfort was now palpable, then back at Dalton. "Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient." Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly, his knuckles whitening. "Miss Levitt, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written." Caroline paused for a beat, letting the silence amplify her next words before responding. "Except when it isn't." A faint murmur rippled from the back of the room. Caroline reached for another document, holding it up for the court to see. "Let's talk about Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg. The defendant in that case was fined under this very statute. Same wording, same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections." She paused for emphasis, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. "You know what the judge said in that ruling? That the law as applied fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unenforceable under scrutiny." Dalton's expression remained blank, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. The city attorney leaned in slightly, a desperate whisper escaping his lips. "Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked." Caroline turned her gaze toward him, cutting him off before he could continue. "Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconciled this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please enlighten us." The attorney hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. Caroline turned back to Dalton, her tone respectful but firm. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it?" Dalton sat back, his eyes scanning her, calculating. Caroline knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, trying to find an angle where he could regain control. Finally, he spoke, his voice strained. "Miss Levitt, I find your interpretation debatable." Caroline smiled slightly, a fleeting, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. "Then let's debate it." The judge's nostrils flared slightly. Then, to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. "The court will take a 15-minute recess." He stood abruptly before anyone could argue, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. Caroline set her papers down, her expression calm, but inside she knew what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to give in, but he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone, and what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. 15 minutes felt like an hour. Caroline remained seated at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the stack of papers in front of her. She wasn't reading them, she didn't need to. The legal precedents, the procedural arguments, the case laws she had cited were all burned into her mind. She was ready. But something about Judge Dalton's abrupt recess didn't sit right with her. He wasn't the type to hesitate, which meant that he was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't accounted for. The door to the judge's chambers swung open, and Dalton strode back in, but this time with a new presence by his side, a second judge. Caroline immediately recognized Judge Alan Whitaker, a senior judge, higher ranking than Dalton. The moment Whitaker entered, the mood in the courtroom shifted again. This wasn't standard protocol. Bringing in another judge mid-hearing wasn't just unusual, it was calculated. Caroline adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable, her internal resolve hardening. Dalton cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I've requested that Judge Whitaker sit in on this matter." Requested? Caroline didn't believe that for a second. Someone had pulled strings. Whitaker gave her a slow nod, his presence calm but authoritative. "Miss Levitt, I understand you've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Statute 14b. "That's correct." Whitaker clasped his hands in front of him. "You believe this fine should be overturned based on appellate precedent?" "I don't believe it. I know it." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitaker arched his eyebrow. "I appreciate your confidence, but let's discuss specifics. You referenced Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a follow-up ruling later clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under localized judicial discretion?" Caroline kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt the shift. So that's what this was. Dalton had stepped back, brought in someone with more authority, and now they were attempting to counter her argument with an overlooked technicality. Caroline folded her hands. "I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor, but I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, something that, in this case, was not done." Whitaker nodded, as if he had expected her to say that. "Then let's talk about that. The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him?" Caroline barely hid her surprise. She hadn't expected that. But she welcomed it. She turned her head. A man stood from the back of the room, Officer Brian Calloway, a municipal enforcement officer. He was middle-aged, dressed in a crisp Navy uniform, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his decisions. Caroline kept her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I would." Dalton gestured for Calloway to step forward. The officer made his way to the witness stand, took his oath, and sat down. Caroline stood, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Caroline turned slightly toward the jury box, where no jury was present, but where the public sat watching. "And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred?" He exhaled, as if the answer was obvious. "The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine." Caroline clasped her hands behind her back. "Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation?" He hesitated. "No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary." She gave him a small, almost amused smile. "You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine." He shifted in his seat. "I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw." Caroline's expression remained calm, but inside she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. This directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the appellate clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier." Whitaker's expression didn't change, but he sat back slightly. He knew she was right. Caroline pressed forward. "So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement?" The silence in the room was deafening. Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench. He wasn't looking at Whitaker, and that told Caroline everything she needed to know. He had expected to win this argument. He had expected Whitaker's presence to back her into a corner, but instead she had taken his own counterpoint and used it to unravel the case against her. Dalton exhaled sharply. "This court will take another recess." Caroline resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back. But when the court reconvened, what Dalton did next was something no one saw coming.
Caroline remained seated as the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the collective whispers a testament to the unexpected turn of events. Another recess? That wasn't a good sign for the judge. It meant he was struggling to regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. But she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Dalton was a man of authority, and if there was one thing people in power hated, it was being challenged. He wasn't going to back down that easily. When the court reconvened, Dalton's demeanor had shifted. Gone was the passive confidence he had walked in with earlier. Now his jaw was set, his expression unreadable, a tight mask of internal conflict. Whitaker was still seated beside him, though this time his posture was more reserved, his presence less interventionist. It was clear he had no intention of stepping in, at least not yet. Dalton cleared his throat, the sound a dry rasp in the quiet room. "Miss Levitt, you have presented compelling arguments." His tone was measured, carefully controlled, but Caroline could hear the tightness in it, the almost imperceptible tremor of a man unused to admitting even the smallest concession. "However," he continued, his voice regaining a touch of its former stiffness, "this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands." Caroline blinked once. That was interesting. So he was digging in. She exhaled slowly, a subtle nod, acknowledging his words, as if she was considering them carefully. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court stenographer. "Can you read back the last statement, please?" The stenographer, a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes, barely hesitated before repeating, her voice clear and precise, "The fine stands." Caroline turned back to Dalton, her gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof, in direct contradiction to established appellate precedent?" Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench, a telltale sign of his mounting frustration. "Miss Levitt, this court has discretion." Caroline's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "It does, but discretion is not immunity from legal standards." The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing where this was going, his face a roadmap of dread. Caroline straightened, stepping closer to the bench, her voice gaining a quiet, resonant power. "Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion." Dalton's silence told her everything she needed to know. She turned to the gallery, sweeping her gaze across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders who had sat through the entire hearing. "Imagine the implications of that," she said, her voice carrying, drawing them into the scenario. "A business owner gets fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner is penalized for something they can't even verify. And if they challenge it, too bad. The court has discretion." A few heads nodded subtly in the gallery, a silent agreement. Caroline turned back to Dalton, her gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof, in direct contradiction to established appellate precedent?" Dalton's grip on the bench tightened, his knuckles white. He knew he had been backed into a corner. There was no winning this, not for him. The city attorney finally interjected, a desperate plea. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton held up a hand, cutting him off. His face was unreadable, but Caroline could see the frustration in his eyes, the dawning realization of defeat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dalton exhaled, a sound of resignation. "This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement." His voice was stiff, almost reluctant, each word a bitter pill. "The fine is overturned." A murmur rippled through the room, a collective sigh of relief and astonishment. Caroline gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench, the sound sharp and final. "Court adjourned." Just like that, it was over. Caroline gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she stepped toward the exit, she heard Dalton's voice one last time. "Miss Levitt." She turned. Dalton's eyes met hers, a flicker of something akin to respect or perhaps grudging admiration in their depths. "You underestimated me." Caroline gave him a small, knowing smile. "You wouldn't be the first." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor, the sound echoing her quiet triumph. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain. This case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. And somewhere, in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. Caroline walked down the marble hallway, her pace steady, but her mind still sharp. The weight of what just happened wasn't lost on her. She had walked into that courtroom expecting a routine hearing. What she got instead was a battle of power, law, and ego. And she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget moments like these. They didn't like losing, especially not in front of a full courtroom. As she neared the courthouse exit, a voice called from behind, "Miss Levitt, a moment." She turned. Find Judge Whitaker approaching, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't the kind of man who engaged in unnecessary small talk, so if he was stopping her now, it wasn't just to exchange pleasantries. Caroline crossed her arms loosely. "Something on your mind, Judge?" Whitaker studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're good." Caroline smiled slightly. "I try." He nodded, glancing briefly at the courtroom doors behind him before lowering his voice just enough so she could hear. "I wasn't brought in to observe, Miss Levitt. I was brought in to contain." Caroline raised her eyebrow. "To contain what, exactly?" Whitaker exhaled, his eyes scanning hers. "Judge Dalton doesn't like losing. In this case, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example." Caroline already knew that, but hearing it confirmed only made the victory feel more significant. She kept her voice even. "So what happens now?" Whitaker hesitated, then gave her a look that held both respect and warning. "You're going to have people watching you, and not just here." Caroline understood exactly what he meant. Today, she had done more than win a case. She had challenged a system that thrived on compliance, and that didn't go unnoticed. "I understand. I appreciate the heads up." Whitaker gave her one last look before stepping back toward the courtroom. Caroline turned toward the exit, pushing the heavy courthouse doors open and stepping into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first time she had fought a battle in court, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was a lesson in today's fight, one that I hoped others would see. Power wasn't about who sat behind the bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. It was about knowing the rules well enough to challenge them. It was about standing firm when others expected you to back down. And most importantly, it was about never assuming that just because someone hands you a ruling, you have to accept it. Caroline Levit had walked into that courtroom expecting a routine hearing. She walked out, having reminded everyone, especially those in power, that the law wasn't just about enforcement. It was about understanding. It was about fighting back. And today, she had done just that. Outro. The story of Caroline Levit reveals profound lessons: the courage to challenge unjust authority, the power of knowledge in upholding justice, and the importance of standing firm for one's principles. It teaches us that true strength lies in not accepting rulings passively, but in questioning them with reason and evidence. In life, we can apply this by confronting unfairness, arming ourselves with understanding, and persisting despite opposition. These principles inspire us to fight for what's right, no matter the odds. Thank you for reading this inspiring tale.
If you found Caroline's story compelling, please like this video, share it with those who need to hear this message, comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that